John Carter, a 72-year-old retired Navy SEAL commander, walked quietly into Haven Ridge Animal Shelter. He wasn't there to adopt a dog. He had come to donate his life savings to care for retired military working dogs. But at the very last kennel, everything changed. An old German shepherd covered in scars slowly lifted its head after hearing a forgotten SEAL whistle, and John froze. It was Shadow, the loyal military dog he had mourned for 8 years. How could a partner declared dead still be alive, and what secret had been buried with him all this time? What happened next will restore your faith in loyalty, hope, and God's perfect timing. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I would love to see how far this story reaches. The late autumn wind drifted quietly across the still lake, carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves toward a weathered cabin where time seemed to move more slowly than anywhere else. John Carter had long ago stopped counting the mornings. At 72, the retired Navy SEAL commander measured time differently than most people. He no longer cared whether it was Monday or Saturday, nor whether another month had quietly slipped away. Instead, he noticed smaller things: how long the mist lingered above the lake before sunrise, how many birds still returned before winter, and how much more effort it took to button his old camouflage jacket with hands that had once climbed cliffs in complete darkness without trembling. The cabin had been built nearly 40 years earlier with his own hands, together with the woman who had believed he would always come home alive. It sat alone on the edge of a quiet Montana lake, surrounded by towering pines that muffled the outside world. The place had once been filled with laughter, coffee brewing before dawn, muddy boots left by the front door, and the comforting certainty that no matter how dangerous his missions became, someone would always be waiting for him. Now the silence had become its permanent resident. His wife, Margaret, had been gone for almost 9 years. Cancer had taken her slowly, patiently, stripping away her strength while never touching the warmth in her smile. Even during her final weeks, when speaking exhausted her, she still insisted on asking whether he had eaten breakfast before reminding him to wear a heavier jacket outside. John had survived firefights, explosions, and covert operations across continents, yet nothing had prepared him for the quiet sound of her breathing disappearing forever one rainy afternoon. He had never remarried. Not because he believed no one else could compare to Margaret, although that was true. He simply could not imagine asking another person to live beside a man whose heart had already buried too many people. John himself had changed after retirement in ways he rarely admitted aloud. The sharp, decisive commander who once issued orders under enemy fire had become a quieter man. Years of responsibility had taught him restraint instead of anger, patience instead of pride. He greeted neighbors with a gentle smile, volunteered at veterans' gatherings when his health allowed, and never spoke about the medals locked away inside an old wooden chest beneath his bed. Those medals meant very little to him now. The memories attached to them weighed far more. His appearance still hinted at the soldier he had once been. His broad shoulders remained surprisingly straight despite his age. Deep lines framed a clean-cut, angular face weathered by decades of sun, wind, and hardship. His steel blue eyes retained the calm awareness that never truly leaves elite operators, constantly observing details others ignored. His neatly trimmed silver crew cut and short boxed beard gave him an air of quiet dignity rather than intimidation. Even after retirement, he continued wearing the same faded woodland camouflage field jacket, matching trousers, a black nylon web belt, and well-maintained brown combat boots. The uniform had long since lost its military purpose, but to John it represented discipline, routine, and the promise he had once made to never forget those who served beside him. Lately, however, his body had begun writing a different story. The bottle of heart medication sitting beside the kitchen sink reminded him every morning that even the strongest hearts eventually grew tired. 2 months earlier, his cardiologist had spoken with careful honesty rather than false optimism. Surgery was possible, but risky. time remained uncertain. John had listened without interrupting, thanked the physician politely, and driven home beneath a sky that looked strangely ordinary. He did not fear dying. What unsettled him was leaving unfinished responsibilities behind. That thought had occupied his mind for weeks. On the kitchen table rested several neatly organized folders, old bank statements, insurance documents, and a handwritten will. Everything had already been arranged. The cabin would be donated to a veterans organization. Personal belongings would go to friends who still remained. There was only one item on his list that required him to leave the house today. A certified check lay inside a plain white envelope. It represented nearly every dollar he had saved beyond what little he needed to survive. John slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket before picking up his truck keys. As he reached the front door, his gaze paused on a faded framed photograph hanging beside it. 5 young SEAL operators stood shoulder to shoulder, covered in dust after completing a classified mission decades earlier. Beside them sat 3 German Shepherd military working dogs wearing tactical harnesses. Every soldier in the photograph looked exhausted. Every dog looked alert. John's fingers rested briefly against the glass. "I hope someone remembered you, boys," he whispered. The old pickup truck rumbled to life with familiar reluctance before carrying him along winding mountain roads. Golden leaves drifted across the windshield as clouds gathered overhead, promising rain before evening. The drive took nearly an hour, giving John more than enough time to question whether he had made the right decision. Many retired veterans donated money to hospitals or scholarship funds. He had chosen dogs. People often thanked soldiers after wars ended. Ceremonies were organized, flags were raised, medals were awarded. Military working dogs rarely received the same ending. Too many served until their bodies broke before quietly disappearing into forgotten corners of the world. John knew that better than most. He remembered each handler who had cried after losing a canine partner. He remembered helicopters lifting away while wounded dogs remained behind, awaiting evacuation. He remembered intelligence missions that had succeeded only because a German Shepherd had detected danger seconds before any human could. Those animals had never questioned an order. They simply trusted. The rescue shelter appeared just outside a small town nestled between rolling hills. Unlike modern adoption centers decorated with colorful banners, this facility consisted of several modest buildings surrounded by sturdy chain-link fences and tall cedar trees. A weathered wooden sign identified it as Haven Ridge Animal Rescue, a nonprofit organization specializing in elderly and abandoned working dogs. The parking lot contained only a handful of vehicles. John climbed out slowly, pressing one hand against his chest until the familiar tightness eased. He disliked allowing strangers to notice moments like that. Before reaching the entrance, he stopped to watch an elderly Labrador sleeping peacefully beneath a maple tree while a volunteer gently covered it with a blanket. Something about that quiet gesture made him smile. Inside the office, the scent of disinfectant blended with fresh coffee and dog food. Framed photographs covered nearly every wall, showing adopted dogs with smiling families, retired police canines, and aging service animals finally resting in comfortable homes. A woman looked up from behind the reception desk as the bell above the door chimed. She appeared to be in her early 60s, slightly shorter than John, with soft brown eyes that reflected years of compassion more than fatigue. Her silver-streaked chestnut hair was tied neatly into a practical ponytail, and laugh lines softened a face shaped by kindness rather than vanity. She wore a simple green shelter jacket over blue jeans, its sleeves marked by countless paw prints that no detergent had ever completely removed. A small silver paw-shaped pendant rested against her sweater. Her name tag read, Sarah Whitmore. Years of caring for abandoned animals had made Sarah remarkably gentle, but also quietly resilient. She had witnessed too many stories of neglect to be easily surprised anymore, yet she still greeted every visitor as though hope might be walking through the front door. She smiled warmly. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Haven Ridge. How can I help you today?" John removed the white envelope from inside his jacket, placed it carefully on the counter, and answered with the calm voice of a man who had spent a lifetime making difficult decisions. "I'm not here to adopt." He gently pushed the envelope toward her. "I'm here to make sure some old heroes aren't forgotten." Sarah looked at the envelope without touching it. People occasionally left donations at Haven Ridge, but they were usually accompanied by cheerful explanations, family stories, or promises to come back with grandchildren. There was something different about the elderly man standing before her. His posture was disciplined without appearing rigid, and his eyes carried the quiet weight she had often seen in combat veterans who had learned to keep entire lifetimes hidden behind polite smiles. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently. "If you've been thinking about adopting, I'd be happy to introduce you to a few of our seniors." John offered a faint smile and slowly shook his head. "I appreciate that, ma'am. But I know why I came." Sarah finally opened the envelope. As she glanced at the certified check, her expression froze. The amount was large enough to cover food, medication, and veterinary care for dozens of elderly working dogs over many months. She looked back at him, visibly stunned. "Mr. Carter." "This is far too much." "It isn't. You've worked your entire life for this." "I have. You may need it someday." John's smile remained calm, almost peaceful. "I probably won't." Sarah noticed the prescription bottle partially visible inside his jacket pocket when he reached for his wallet. Years of volunteering with elderly veterans had taught her not to ask unnecessary questions. Some truths revealed themselves without words. She carefully set the check back inside the envelope. "Would you at least allow me to show you what your generosity will do?" John hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I'd like that." Sarah led him through a set of double doors into the main kennel building. The chorus of barking rose immediately, echoing beneath the high ceiling. Some dogs jumped excitedly against their gates. Others wagged their tails with cautious optimism whenever footsteps approached. A few simply watched in silence, having already learned not to expect visitors to stop. Each kennel displayed a small information card. Age, medical history, temperament. Whether the dog had once served in law enforcement, search and rescue, private security, or military service. John slowed instinctively at every enclosure. He crouched beside an aging Belgian Malinois missing part of one ear. The dog approached cautiously before resting its muzzle against the fence. "IED detection," Sarah explained quietly. "Retired police K9. His handler passed away last winter. No family could keep him." John scratched the dog's chin through the chain links. "You did good, partner." The Malinois leaned into the touch without making a sound. Farther down the hallway rested a Labrador whose muzzle had turned almost completely white with age. "Explosive detection at an airport," Sarah said. 13 years old. John smiled again. "Still watching everyone who walks past?" "He never stopped working," Sarah replied. "Neither had you," John thought. As they continued walking, Sarah shared small stories instead of statistics. One dog had waited outside a hospital every afternoon after its retired handler died because it could no longer understand why no one came home. Another had spent years locked in a backyard after retirement because its owners believed old working dogs were too difficult to handle. John listened quietly. Every story felt painfully familiar. The country celebrated military victories, but too often forgot those who had earned them, especially the ones with 4 legs. Near the center of the building, several volunteers were preparing medication. One young veterinary technician waved politely before returning to bandaging the injured paw of a senior shepherd. The technician, Emily Ross, appeared no older than 28. She had sandy blonde hair tucked beneath a navy baseball cap, clear hazel eyes, and a slim athletic build shaped by long hours lifting dogs that often weighed nearly as much as she did. Her face still held the youthful optimism of someone who believed every frightened animal deserved another chance. Sarah quietly mentioned that Emily had turned down higher-paying veterinary clinics because she preferred helping abandoned working dogs instead of healthy household pets. John admired that. Some people served without ever wearing a uniform. As they reached another hallway, the barking gradually faded. "This section houses our oldest residents," Sarah said softly. "Most visitors don't make it this far." The air felt different here. Quieter. Slower. Several elderly dogs slept peacefully beneath thick blankets. Others barely raised their heads when strangers passed. Arthritis, fading eyesight, and old injuries had stolen much of their energy, but not their dignity. John's pace slowed almost unconsciously. He found himself reading each kennel card more carefully than before. Retired K9, former search dog, age 12, age 13, chronic hip disease, blind, waiting for hospice adoption. He swallowed quietly. So many faithful lives had reached their final chapters inside concrete walls instead of family homes. Sarah noticed the sadness settling across his face. "We try," she whispered. "We really do. Some stay only a few days before wonderful families take them home. Others—" She glanced toward the end of the corridor. "Others simply wait." John followed her gaze. The final row of kennels sat partially hidden around a corner, away from the brighter lights near the entrance. Few sounds came from that direction. The silence itself seemed strangely heavy. "I'd like to see all of them," he said. Sarah nodded. "Of course." They walked slowly toward the last enclosure. The concrete floor showed fresh mop marks, yet one kennel remained strangely untouched by excitement. No barking greeted approaching footsteps. No tail struck against the metal gate. Instead, an elderly German shepherd lay motionless in the darkest corner, almost blending into the shadows. Its thick black and tan coat had faded with age. Gray hairs covered the muzzle and brows. Old scars crossed the shoulders, ribs, and one rear leg, each one telling the story of injuries that had healed long before arriving here. One ear carried a permanent notch, while the dog itself appeared unnaturally still, conserving every ounce of remaining strength. Sarah lowered her voice. "That one's different." John stepped closer. "How so?" "No name, no confirmed records, no microchip anyone could identify. Someone abandoned him outside our gate 6 months ago before sunrise." She paused briefly. "He almost never responds to visitors." John studied the shepherd without speaking. Something tugged unexpectedly at the edge of his memory. Not recognition. Not yet. Only an odd sense that he had seen the dog's posture somewhere long ago. The shepherd remained lying still. Its eyes stayed closed. Its breathing was slow and even. Sarah sighed softly. "We've tried everything. Veterinarians, trainers, former handlers. He eats, he cooperates during treatment. But emotionally—" She shook her head. "It's like he stopped believing anyone was coming back." John felt an ache deep inside his chest that had nothing to do with his heart disease. Without thinking, he rested one hand lightly against the kennel gate. His fingers tightened around the cold steel. Some instinct older than conscious memory stirred within him, an old habit, a sound he had not made in nearly a decade. Almost absent-mindedly, John pursed his lips and gave a short, precise whistle. Not an ordinary whistle. A coded SEAL canine recall signal that only one specialized military unit had ever used. The sharp whistle echoed through the quiet hallway, cutting across the silence like a voice carried from another lifetime. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the old German shepherd's ears twitched. Sarah Whitmore drew in a quiet breath. During the 6 months the mysterious shepherd had lived at Haven Ridge, she had watched experienced trainers, former police handlers, veterinarians, and volunteers attempt to reach him. Some had offered treats. Others had tried toys or soft encouragement. The dog had accepted food when necessary and tolerated medical examinations without resistance. But emotionally, he remained somewhere far away, locked behind invisible walls no one had been able to enter. Now, before either of them could speak, the elderly shepherd slowly lifted his head. His cloudy amber eyes focused on the gray-haired veteran standing outside the kennel. John Carter felt every muscle in his body tense. The expression in the dog's eyes was not curiosity. It was recognition. The shepherd struggled to his feet with surprising determination, despite obvious stiffness in his joints. His movements revealed the lingering pain of old injuries, yet every motion carried remarkable discipline. Instead of barking or rushing toward the gate, he stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, ears forward, waiting for another command. John's heart pounded against his ribs. He had seen that posture thousands of times, not in ordinary obedience classes, not in police demonstrations, only within one highly classified SEAL canine training program that had operated decades earlier. His voice became barely more than a whisper. "No." Sarah glanced back and forth between the veteran and the silent dog. "Mr. Carter?" John barely heard her. His mind had already traveled backward through nearly 30 years of memories. He remembered young handlers laughing beside transport helicopters before dawn. He remembered endless training exercises in isolated deserts where every whistle, every hand signal, every command had been refined until both soldier and dog reacted without conscious thought. He remembered nights when success depended entirely upon absolute trust between human and animal. Most of all, he remembered one particular German shepherd. Carefully, John raised his left hand, 2 fingers, palm inward, another tactical signal. The elderly dog responded immediately. Without hesitation, he lowered his body into the exact silent observation position required before reconnaissance missions. His breathing remained calm. His eyes never left John's face. Sarah covered her mouth. "I've never," she whispered. "I've never seen him do that." Neither had anyone else. John stepped closer until only the steel gate separated them. His weathered hands trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with age. The shepherd studied him for several long seconds before taking one slow step forward, then another. The old dog stopped only inches from the gate. He gently lowered his head, not in fear, in trust. John slowly reached through the chain links. His fingertips brushed the coarse fur between the shepherd's ears. The reaction shattered what little composure remained inside him. The dog closed his eyes. A deep, exhausted sigh escaped his chest, as though he had finally reached the destination he had been searching for during countless lonely years. John felt moisture gathering in his own eyes. His voice cracked. "Shadow." The name seemed to awaken something buried deep inside the animal's memory. The shepherd's ears lifted. His tail moved once, only once. But after months of complete emotional withdrawal, that single movement left Sarah speechless. She stared at John. "You know him?" John swallowed hard before answering. "I don't just know him." He looked directly into the dog's aging eyes. "He saved my life." Silence filled the hallway. Even the barking from distant kennels seemed impossibly far away. Sarah unlocked the kennel without speaking. She trusted her instincts. Everything unfolding before her felt too genuine to question. The heavy gate swung open. Shadow did not rush outside. Instead, he walked slowly toward John with quiet dignity. Every step revealed arthritis in his hips, yet his head remained high. When he reached the retired commander, he gently rested the side of his muzzle against John's chest, exactly where he had done countless times after dangerous operations decades earlier. John instinctively wrapped both arms around the old shepherd. He had imagined many endings throughout retirement. None had included embracing a companion whose death he had mourned 8 years earlier. For several moments, neither soldier nor dog moved. Sarah quietly stepped back to give them privacy. She noticed tears slipping silently down John's face. Not dramatic sobs, simply the silent grief of a man discovering that part of his family had somehow survived when he had spent years believing otherwise. Finally, John crouched beside Shadow. He examined the old scars crossing the dog's shoulders and ribs with the practiced eyes of someone who understood combat injuries. These weren't here before. Shadow remained perfectly still. John traced another scar along the left rear leg. Gunshot. He recognized the pattern immediately. Another healed wound crossed the shoulder at an angle that suggested shrapnel rather than teeth or fencing. Whoever had possessed Shadow after his disappearance had certainly not allowed him to live peacefully. Sarah knelt beside them. "I wish I could tell you where he came from." John looked up. "What do you mean?" "We don't know." She spoke with quiet frustration. "One morning last winter, one of our volunteers found him lying outside the front gate before sunrise. No vehicle, no witnesses. Someone simply abandoned him and disappeared." John frowned. "No identification?" Sarah shook her head. "No readable microchip, no service records, no owner information." She hesitated. "The strange part is that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one could identify him." John slowly turned back toward Shadow. Military working dogs always carried multiple forms of identification. Microchips, registration records, tattoo numbers in older generations, equipment markings. Removing every trace required planning and purpose. That realization unsettled him more than anything else. This had not been an accident. Someone had wanted Shadow to disappear. John gently scratched beneath the shepherd's chin. "I buried you," he whispered. "I stood beside an empty coffin, because they told us there wasn't enough left to recover." Shadow leaned quietly against his leg. The old soldier closed his eyes. One impossible question echoed through his mind. If Shadow had never died, who had convinced an entire military unit that he had? John remained beside Shadow's kennel long after Sarah quietly excused herself to give them privacy. Time seemed to lose its meaning inside the dim hallway. The old German shepherd rested calmly against his leg, breathing with the slow rhythm of an exhausted veteran who had finally found someone familiar after years of isolation. John gently stroked the thick black and tan fur along Shadow's neck, noticing how age had silvered the muzzle and how countless scars disappeared beneath the dense coat. Every mark represented years that neither military records nor official reports had ever acknowledged. Eventually, Sarah returned, carrying a thick folder. "I thought you should see everything we have," she said. John accepted it carefully. The file contained little. Several veterinary reports documented arthritis, healed fractures, old shrapnel wounds, and severe malnutrition when the shepherd first arrived. There were photographs taken on admission, each showing an emaciated dog whose ribs had been painfully visible beneath dirty fur. No ownership documents accompanied him. No previous medical history existed. Even the estimated age had been guessed by the attending veterinarian. John turned each page slowly. Someone had erased nearly an entire life. Sarah folded her hands together. "I've worked in animal rescue for almost 20 years. I've seen abandoned military dogs before. Some came with incomplete records. Others arrived without collars." She paused before continuing. "But I've never seen anyone remove every possible trace of a dog's identity this thoroughly." John looked up. "You believe it was intentional?" "I do." There was no hesitation in her answer. Microchips don't simply disappear. Service collars don't vanish by accident. Somebody wanted this dog to become impossible to identify. John closed the folder. His instincts, sharpened through decades of military service, reached the same conclusion. This had required planning, which meant there had been a reason. Later that afternoon, John completed the adoption paperwork. Sarah noticed that despite his age, he read every page carefully before signing, just as someone accustomed to military precision would. He asked thoughtful questions about Shadow's medications, diet, sleeping habits, and physical limitations rather than rushing the process. "You've done this before," Sarah observed. John smiled faintly. "Not adoption." He looked toward Shadow. "But we've taken care of each other before." Emily Ross, the young veterinary technician, entered carrying a small cardboard box containing medication, joint supplements, medical records, and enough food for several days. Up close, she seemed even younger than John had first thought, though determination gave her an air of maturity beyond her years. Her hazel eyes reflected genuine affection as she knelt beside Shadow one final time. "I'll miss you, old boy." Shadow gently touched his nose against her hand. Emily smiled through moist eyes. "He almost never lets people do that." John noticed. The old shepherd clearly trusted the young technician, proof that kindness had slowly reached him despite everything he had endured. Before leaving, Sarah walked them to the parking lot. The autumn air had grown colder, and light rain had begun falling across the mountains. She placed one hand gently on Shadow's shoulder. "I don't know who abandoned him," she said quietly, "but I have a feeling they knew exactly where to leave him." John frowned. "What makes you think that?" "Haven Ridge specializes in retired working dogs. We're almost 50 miles from the nearest highway. Someone drove a long way to bring him here." She looked toward John. "And somehow, I think they hoped the right person would eventually find him." John considered her words during the drive home. Shadow lay quietly across the back seat, occasionally lifting his head whenever the truck slowed before settling again. Every few miles, John glanced into the rearview mirror, almost expecting the image to disappear like a dream. It never did. When they reached the cabin beside the lake, Shadow stepped out slowly, sniffing the cool mountain air. He stood motionless for several seconds before following John onto the porch without needing a command. "It still feels like home, doesn't it?" The shepherd looked at him calmly. Inside, little had changed over the years. The cabin remained neat, warm, and filled with photographs of another lifetime. Shadow wandered carefully through each room with measured steps. Occasionally he paused beneath framed military photographs, as though fragments of memory lingered somewhere beyond conscious thought. Near sunset, John prepared a simple meal. Shadow ate slowly but steadily before curling beside the stone fireplace. Only after the dog had fallen asleep did John finally allow himself to examine the worn leather collar Sarah had removed during the adoption process. Time had nearly destroyed it. The leather had become cracked, brittle, and stained by years of weather. Most people would have thrown it away without a second glance. John almost did the same. Then his fingers stopped. Something felt unusual. The collar seemed slightly thicker along one narrow section beneath the inner lining. His expression sharpened. During his military career, specialized working dogs occasionally carried concealed emergency identification devices hidden inside reinforced collars. The design had never been common and certainly never known outside a handful of classified programs. He retrieved a small utility knife from the kitchen drawer. Working with patient hands, he carefully loosened several decayed stitches that had nearly dissolved with age. The leather separated just enough to reveal a thin, waterproof compartment concealed inside. John's breathing slowed. Within it rested a tiny military-grade data chip sealed inside transparent protective resin. Untouched, undiscovered. For 8 years, He stared at it in complete silence. No ordinary civilian could have recognized what it was. No shelter volunteer would ever have searched beneath the lining of an old collar. Someone had hidden it so carefully that even years of hardship had failed to expose it. John lifted the tiny chip into the light. The engraved military serial number had faded, but one fragment remained readable. His pulse quickened. If this chip had survived, then whatever had truly happened to Shadow might have survived as well. Across the room, Shadow quietly opened his eyes and watched the old commander holding the tiny piece of forgotten military history. Neither of them yet realized that the smallest object in the cabin carried the first thread of a secret someone had successfully buried for nearly a decade. The first light of dawn filtered through the pine trees surrounding the lakeside cabin, casting long golden reflections across the still water. Inside, neither the old soldier nor the aging German shepherd had slept much. John Carter sat alone at the kitchen table, the tiny military data chip resting on a folded handkerchief beneath the warm glow of an old brass lamp. He had examined it countless times during the night, turning it carefully between weathered fingers, searching for clues hidden within its faded markings. The engraved military serial number was incomplete, but the construction itself immediately confirmed one thing. This was never intended for civilian use. Only a handful of classified military canine programs had ever received chips manufactured in that format. Across the room, Shadow lay quietly beside the stone fireplace. Although arthritis had stiffened his joints and age had dulled some of his speed, nothing about his awareness had disappeared. Every few minutes, the old German shepherd lifted his head to check on John before settling back down, as though decades of partnership still remained deeply rooted in instinct. John looked toward him and smiled faintly. "You never really stopped watching my back, did you?" Shadow answered only with a slow wag of his tail. The peaceful moment stirred memories John had tried not to revisit for years. During active deployments, mornings had often begun exactly like this. Not with conversation, but with silent preparation. Men who trusted each other with their lives rarely needed many words. The dogs understood even less language than humans, yet somehow understood everything that truly mattered. John poured another cup of black coffee before carrying both the mug and the tiny data chip into his modest study. The room served as both library and workshop. Military history books lined one wall. Family photographs occupied another. An aging desktop computer, assembled years earlier by one of his former teammates, still sat neatly on a sturdy oak desk. It lacked modern speed, but John had kept it carefully maintained. He connected a military-grade adapter stored inside an old metal toolbox. Years ago, retiring personnel had occasionally been permitted to retain obsolete hardware after sensitive components had supposedly been rendered useless. John had never expected to use it again. The software recognized the chip immediately, then rejected it. Access denied. Classified archive. Authorization required. John leaned back. "So, you're still protected." His disappointment lasted only seconds before another thought emerged. If the system still recognized the encryption, someone else certainly could. Someone who had once worked beside him. He reached for an old leather notebook filled with handwritten names and telephone numbers accumulated over decades. Many entries had already been crossed out. Some friends had passed away. Others suffered illnesses that prevented travel. A few had simply disappeared into quiet retirement. His finger stopped beside one familiar name, Michael Donovan. John allowed himself a rare smile. If anyone outside active service still possessed the knowledge to access forgotten military systems, it was Mike. Nearly 45 years earlier, Michael Donovan had earned the nickname Professor, despite serving with one of the toughest SEAL units in the Navy. While others excelled in explosives or reconnaissance, Mike possessed an extraordinary talent for electronics, communications, and code breaking. Even in his 70s, he remained fascinated by computers, spending retirement restoring antique radios and helping veterans recover damaged military archives for museums. John picked up the telephone. The line rang 3 times. A deep voice answered. "If you're calling to sell insurance, you've chosen the wrong old man." John laughed for the first time in weeks. "I was hoping to reach an even older one." Silence followed. Then came an explosion of laughter. "John? It's been too long." "No kidding. Last time I saw you, your beard was half that color. And you still thought haircuts were optional." The easy humor returned almost instantly, as though decades had never passed. After several minutes of catching up, John's voice gradually became more serious. "I need your help." Mike heard the change immediately. "You found something." "I found someone." John glanced toward Shadow sleeping near the fireplace. "I'll explain everything. But first, tell me you're still keeping that ridiculous collection of military hardware." Mike chuckled. "My wife keeps threatening to throw it all away. So that's a yes." "It is." John lowered his voice. "I have a military canine data chip." Silence. Not surprised silence. Professional silence. Finally, Mike spoke. "What kind?" "I'll send you photographs." "No." Mike's answer came immediately. "Bring it yourself." John frowned. "You think it's that important?" "I think if you're calling me instead of the Pentagon, there's a reason." John appreciated that Mike still understood him without lengthy explanations. "Can you do it today?" "I'll clear the schedule." After ending the call, John quietly packed the chip inside a padded metal case. Shadow had already risen to his feet. The old shepherd watched every movement with careful attention. "We're taking a drive." At those words, Shadow's ears lifted. The response made John pause. Even after 8 years of separation, the dog still recognized ordinary mission preparation. Michael Donovan lived nearly 3 hours away in a small farming community surrounded by rolling fields and old maple forests. His farmhouse reflected its owner perfectly, simple, orderly, and filled with practical solutions rather than decoration. Standing on the porch waiting for them was a broad-shouldered man of 73 whose posture remained surprisingly upright despite age. Michael's square face carried deep laugh lines around intelligent gray eyes that missed very little. Thick silver hair curled untidily above his ears despite obvious attempts to comb it into place, while a full gray beard softened features once known throughout the team for intimidating young recruits. Years spent solving impossible technical problems had made him patient, analytical, and remarkably difficult to rattle. Losing his younger brother during military service had also left him fiercely loyal to every surviving teammate, treating them less like friends than family. As John climbed from the truck, Mike's attention immediately shifted past him. The old technician froze. His eyes widened. "No." Shadow stepped down slowly from the back seat. Mike stared as though seeing a ghost. His weathered hands began trembling. "I buried that dog." "So did I," John answered quietly. For several long seconds, neither man moved. Then Mike slowly approached. Shadow studied him carefully before taking 2 measured steps forward. The old German shepherd sniffed the familiar scent lingering beneath decades of age. Recognition came gradually. Shadow gently nudged Mike's hand. Mike closed his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned." He wrapped one arm around the shepherd's neck. "I thought we lost you, old boy." The reunion remained quiet, but the emotion required no dramatic words. Eventually, all 3 entered Mike's workshop. John carefully placed the small metal case on the workbench. Without opening it immediately, Mike looked toward John. "Before I touch this," he nodded toward Shadow, "tell me everything that happened after we thought he died." John drew a slow breath. "I wish I knew." He looked at the shepherd lying quietly beside the workbench. That's exactly what we're about to find out. Michael Donovan carefully opened the small metal case, his movement slow enough to suggest he was handling something far more fragile than a piece of electronics. The workshop fell silent except for the soft humming of aging computers and the distant tapping of rain against the farmhouse windows. Shadow settled quietly beside John's chair, watching the two former SEALs with calm, attentive eyes. Mike slid the chip beneath a high-powered magnifier before giving a low whistle. "This isn't just military hardware," he murmured. "It's from the old Special Canine Operations Archive. I haven't seen one of these since before retirement." He connected a succession of adapters that looked almost as old as the workshop itself. Several monitors flickered to life, displaying outdated military software that modern systems no longer recognized. Password prompts appeared one after another before Mike typed a series of authorization codes from memory. The first attempt failed. The second reached another encrypted layer. John watched without speaking. He remembered countless missions where Mike had remained this focused, blocking out every distraction until the impossible slowly became possible. After nearly 30 minutes, a new message appeared. "Archive restored." Mike leaned closer. "That's odd." "What?" "I expected deployment records." Instead, a list of identification numbers filled the screen. Each number was paired with a military working dog's name, breed, age, service branch, and operational status. John immediately recognized the format. "Personnel records." Mike nodded. "But look at the last column." The status field repeated the same word over and over. "Deceased." John's expression hardened. He scrolled farther. Another page, then another. Dozens of German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labrador Retrievers from different military units had all supposedly died after retirement processing. Mike frowned. "That's statistically impossible." John silently agreed. Military working dogs certainly died, but not in such concentrated numbers and not across so many installations within only a few years. Mike selected the first record. Instead of closing, an additional hidden file opened beneath it. His eyebrows rose. "Well, that's definitely not supposed to be here." "What is it?" "A second database." The hidden column contained transportation records, civilian truck registrations, warehouse numbers, private invoices, anonymous payment references. None of them belonged inside official military retirement files. John felt his pulse quicken. They weren't documenting deaths. Mike slowly shook his head. They were documenting transfers. The realization settled heavily between them. One by one, they opened additional records. Every file followed the same disturbing pattern. Official military archive, deceased. Hidden archive, transferred, relocated, delivered, payment confirmed. Neither man spoke for several minutes. The rain outside seemed louder now. John stared at the names scrolling across the screen. Some belonged to dogs he had met during joint training exercises decades earlier. Others had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Eastern Europe, and humanitarian rescue operations following natural disasters. Heroes. Every one of them officially remembered as dead. Mike quietly enlarged another file. Attached to several names were recent veterinary purchase records from private security companies and illegal breeding facilities. A handful carried updated location coordinates only months old. John leaned closer. They're still alive. Some of them are. Mike's voice had become unusually quiet. And whoever built this hidden archive kept updating it. John looked toward Shadow. The old shepherd calmly met his gaze. For 8 years, he had unknowingly carried the only surviving copy of evidence someone had desperately tried to erase. Mike continued searching. There aren't hundreds. How many? He counted carefully. 37 confirmed dogs. John exhaled slowly. 37 military working dogs. 37 loyal partners whose handlers had almost certainly grieved them, believing official reports without question. Mike opened another attachment. Photographs appeared. Some showed elderly dogs inside overcrowded kennels. Others wore crude tracking collars belonging to private compounds. One image showed a gray-faced German shepherd chained behind a rusting warehouse. Another displayed 2 retired military dogs confined inside breeding pens. John felt anger rising deep inside him, not explosive anger, but the cold, disciplined kind that had carried him through dangerous operations. They served this country. Mike nodded, and somebody turned them into property. The room remained silent. Finally, Mike removed his glasses and rubbed tired eyes. This archive wasn't created by one person. No. It would have taken access to retirement records, logistics, transportation, and finance. John understood exactly what that meant. An organized operation, years in duration, protected by people who knew how military paperwork worked. Mike closed the files without deleting anything. We need multiple backups. Within minutes, encrypted copies existed on separate drives. Only then did John carefully place the original chip back inside its protective case. He looked down at Shadow. The old dog slowly stood, despite the stiffness in his joints, and walked to John's side exactly as he had done before countless missions. His cloudy amber eyes seemed calmer now, almost as though some invisible burden had finally begun lifting. John rested one hand on the shepherd's neck. I thought my last mission ended the day I retired. Shadow quietly leaned against him. Mike watched the pair for several moments. What are you thinking? John answered without hesitation. I'm thinking 37 families deserve the truth. And the dogs? John looked toward the photograph still glowing on the monitor. They deserve to go home. Mike smiled sadly. I was afraid you'd say that. You knew I would. I did. The old technician walked across the workshop and opened a weathered storage cabinet. From inside, he removed a large, folded road map of the United States, laying it across the workbench. One by one, they marked every confirmed location recovered from the hidden archive. Small red circles gradually spread across several states. Some lay only a day's drive away. Others were hundreds of miles apart. John studied the map in silence. His cardiologist had warned him to avoid physical strain. His savings were almost gone after the donation to Haven Ridge. His heart might not allow him many more years. None of those thoughts changed his decision. He folded the map carefully. This isn't about exposing a scandal anymore. Mike nodded. It's about bringing soldiers home. John clipped the metal case securely inside his jacket. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Pale evening sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the wet fields beyond the farmhouse. Shadow walked beside him toward the truck. Despite his age, despite the scars, despite the years that had been stolen from him, the old German shepherd carried himself with unmistakable purpose. John opened the passenger side door instead of the rear. This time, he said softly, you ride beside me. Shadow climbed into the seat without needing a command. John started the engine and looked once more at the map resting on the dashboard. Their destination was still uncertain. Their mission was not. For the first time since retiring from the Navy, John Carter felt the quiet certainty that had guided him through every operation of his military career. His final mission had just begun. A pale morning sun rose through low autumn clouds as John's old pickup truck rolled steadily along a quiet country highway, carrying 2 aging veterans toward a mission neither of them had ever expected to undertake. The folded map Michael Donovan had marked the previous evening rested on the passenger seat beside Shadow. Red circles identified locations scattered across several states, but one stood closer than all the others. Less than 3 hours away, an abandoned breeding facility had recently purchased 2 elderly German shepherds through a chain of private brokers. According to the hidden records recovered from the military chip, both dogs had officially been declared dead nearly 7 years earlier. John tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had commanded rescue operations before. He had planned hostage recoveries under enemy fire. Yet this journey felt strangely different. There would be no helicopters, no tactical teams, no classified orders, only an old man, an elderly military dog, and a promise made to companions who never had the opportunity to ask for help. Shadow remained unusually alert despite the long drive. Every time the truck slowed near crossroads or unfamiliar buildings, the old German shepherd quietly lifted his head, scanning his surroundings with instincts that decades of retirement had failed to erase. Although arthritis stiffened his movements whenever they stopped, nothing had diminished the calm intelligence reflected in his amber eyes. Several hours later, the truck turned onto a narrow gravel road lined with neglected fencing and overgrown weeds. The landscape grew increasingly isolated until an aging livestock property finally appeared beyond a cluster of dying oak trees. Rusted metal gates surrounded several weather-beaten kennels hidden behind tall sheet metal walls designed to block visibility from the road. John parked nearly half a mile away. He studied the property through a pair of compact binoculars stored beneath the driver's seat. Nothing about the facility appeared welcoming. Broken equipment littered the yard. Water troughs stood nearly empty. Several dogs barked continuously from unseen kennels. Shadow quietly stared toward the buildings. His ears slowly moved forward. John recognized the expression immediately. The old shepherd had detected something familiar. "We're close." Rather than walking directly onto the property, John chose caution. Years of military experience had taught him that gathering information often prevented unnecessary confrontation. He drove into the nearest small town where he stopped at a modest family-owned diner overlooking the main street. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s, named Martha Collins. She possessed the relaxed confidence common among people who had spent decades serving the same community. Slightly heavyset, with neatly styled silver hair, warm brown eyes, and lightly freckled skin weathered by years beneath the Midwestern sun, Martha greeted nearly every customer by name. Losing her husband, a volunteer firefighter, many years earlier had transformed grief into quiet compassion. Since then, she had developed a habit of listening carefully whenever strangers appeared troubled. She poured John fresh coffee before noticing the elderly German shepherd lying patiently outside the front window. "That's a beautiful old dog." "He is." "Military?" John nodded. "So were several others." Martha's expression became thoughtful. "You asking about the place on Miller Road?" John looked up. "I didn't mention a location." "You didn't have to." She leaned against the counter. "You're the third person who's quietly asked questions over the past year." John remained silent. People often revealed more when allowed to continue naturally. Martha lowered her voice. "Locals stay away from that property." "Why?" "Officially, it's a private breeding business." She hesitated. "But nobody ever sees puppies leaving." Instead, she looked toward the window. "People hear old dogs crying at night." John felt a heaviness settle inside his chest. "Has anyone reported it?" "Animal control came twice." "They found nothing?" "They weren't allowed beyond the front buildings." Martha sighed. "The owner always seems prepared." That answer troubled John more than accusations themselves. Prepared people usually expected inspections. After thanking Martha, John spent another hour quietly observing the property from different locations surrounding the area. Eventually, he found a wooded hill overlooking the rear section of the facility. Using binoculars again, he finally saw what had remained hidden. Several elderly German shepherds occupied narrow outdoor runs behind the main barns. None appeared aggressive. Most barely moved. Their gray muzzles and slow gait immediately revealed advanced age. These were not breeding animals. These were retired working dogs. John counted 6, then 7, finally 8. 2 of them suddenly caught Shadow's attention. The old shepherd stood beside John, muscles tensing despite aching joints. His ears rose fully upright. A low whine escaped his throat. John slowly adjusted the binoculars. Inside neighboring enclosures lay 2 elderly German shepherds, unlike the others. Both carried themselves with remarkable discipline despite obvious neglect. One male possessed a broad black saddle, faded tan markings, and a distinctive scar crossing his right shoulder. The second, a slightly smaller female with graying fur around intelligent amber eyes, rested quietly beside him. Even from a distance, they maintained constant awareness of each other's position. Military pairs. John's breathing slowed. He carefully compared the dogs with photographs copied from the hidden archive. The first matched almost perfectly. Ranger, former explosives detection specialist, officially deceased. The second, Bella, search and rescue canine, also officially deceased. Neither had died. Both had simply disappeared. Shadow gave another quiet whine. Not excitement. Recognition. John gently rested a hand upon the old shepherd's neck. "You know them." Shadow never looked away from the distant kennels. For several moments, John simply watched. The years had changed all 3 dogs. Gray fur had replaced youthful strength. Old injuries had slowed once powerful bodies. Yet something remained unmistakably unchanged. Discipline. Patience. The quiet dignity shared only by those who had once served beside soldiers. John lowered the binoculars. His voice became barely audible. "We're taking them home." He looked once more across the neglected property, already beginning to consider the safest, most lawful way to remove the forgotten heroes from the place where they had spent far too many years waiting. John understood that anger alone would accomplish nothing. During his years in the SEALs, he had learned that patience often achieved what force never could. Instead of confronting the owner of the property, he contacted the county sheriff's office, the state animal welfare agency, and a veterans legal organization recommended by Michael Donovan. The hidden records recovered from Shadow's collar did not yet prove the larger conspiracy, but they provided enough evidence to justify a formal welfare inspection. By late afternoon, 2 animal welfare officers arrived with a court-authorized inspection order. John deliberately remained outside the main gate with Shadow, allowing the authorities to perform their duties without interference. Nearly 40 minutes passed before one of the officers waved him forward. The smell reached him before the kennels did. Moist concrete, stale air, untreated wounds, and years of neglect lingered beneath the metal roof. The elderly dogs remained astonishingly quiet. They no longer barked at strangers. It was as though disappointment had slowly replaced expectation. When John entered the rear kennel area with permission from the officers, Shadow stopped walking. Across the aisle, the broad-shouldered German shepherd identified in the hidden archive slowly struggled to his feet. Time had changed Ranger beyond recognition. His once powerful frame had become lean, gray fur covered his muzzle, and old scars crossed both shoulders. Yet despite age and hardship, he stood with unmistakable composure, quietly studying the old shepherd beside John. For several long seconds, neither dog moved. Then Shadow took one slow step forward. Ranger answered with one of his own. The 2 elderly military dogs touched noses through the kennel fence. No barking, no growling. Only the silent recognition of partners who had survived another lifetime. Even the animal welfare officers stopped speaking. One quietly whispered, I've never seen anything like that. In the neighboring enclosure, Bella slowly approached as well. She had been slightly smaller than Ranger even during active service, and age had softened her athletic build. Her once rich black and tan coat had faded, while silver fur surrounded intelligent amber eyes that still reflected remarkable gentleness. During her years as a military search and rescue dog, handlers had often described her as unusually calm under pressure. Whatever had happened after retirement had never erased that quiet nature. When Shadow turned toward her, Bella gently lowered her head before carefully pressing against the fence. John felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. These dogs remembered. Not commands, not missions, each other. The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours. Veterinary staff documented untreated arthritis, chronic malnutrition, infected paws, and inadequate living conditions affecting multiple elderly dogs. By sunset, the authorities determined that several animals required immediate removal for medical treatment, including Ranger and Bella. As the kennel doors finally opened, neither dog attempted to run. Instead, they walked slowly toward Shadow. The 3 aging German shepherds stood together in complete silence. John wondered how many years had passed since they had last seen another military working dog. He suspected they had never expected such a reunion. Veterinarians loaded the rescued dogs into climate-controlled transport vehicles while John completed temporary foster paperwork through Haven Ridge Animal Rescue. Sarah Whitmore, after receiving John's phone call earlier that afternoon, had immediately offered to coordinate emergency placement for every retired working dog removed from the property. "Bring them home," she had simply said. "We'll make room." The journey back to Haven Ridge began the following morning. News of the rescue spread more quickly than anyone anticipated after one of the responding officers shared photographs with a local reporter. The images did not focus on damaged buildings or law enforcement activity. Instead, newspapers chose a different photograph. 3 elderly German shepherds standing quietly together beside an aging veteran in a faded camouflage jacket. The headline appeared in dozens of local publications before the end of the week. "Retired Navy veteran helps rescue forgotten military dogs." John disliked attention, but he understood that publicity could save lives. Within days, telephone calls began arriving at Haven Ridge from across the country. Some callers wanted to donate. Others volunteered transportation, veterinary services, or foster homes. Then came something John had never expected. A man in his late 70s arrived at the shelter carrying a faded leather leash. His name was Daniel Foster. Tall and lean despite his age, Daniel possessed weathered bronze skin, deep-set blue eyes, and neatly combed white hair. A trimmed gray mustache framed a face marked by years of quiet endurance rather than bitterness. After serving as an Army dog handler decades earlier, he had spent years believing his partner had died overseas. Losing that dog had affected him more deeply than many people understood, leaving him unable to work with another animal again. Sarah introduced him softly. "Daniel, I think there's someone you should meet." When Ranger slowly walked into the visitation yard, Daniel froze. The leash slipped from his fingers. His breathing became uneven. "No." He slowly knelt despite aching knees. "Buddy?" Ranger stopped, his ears lifted. The old dog stared for several seconds before limping forward. Then, with remarkable gentleness, he rested his head against Daniel's shoulder. The elderly veteran broke into quiet tears. "I told everyone you never abandoned me." John quietly turned away, giving them privacy. That reunion became the first of several. Military organizations helped identify additional former handlers whose dogs had vanished years earlier under suspicious circumstances. One after another, aging veterans arrived at Haven Ridge carrying photographs, worn collars, and memories they had believed belonged only to the past. Every reunion seemed to spread farther across television broadcasts and social media. Communities organized food drives. Children wrote letters thanking retired military dogs for their service. Veterinarians volunteered weekends without charge. Retired truck drivers offered free transportation for future rescues. What had begun with one forgotten German shepherd lying silently in the corner of a shelter had become something much larger. As John stood outside Haven Ridge one evening watching Shadow, Ranger, and Bella resting together beneath the fading autumn sun, Sarah quietly joined him. "You've started something remarkable." John slowly shook his head. "No." He watched the 3 elderly dogs sleeping peacefully for perhaps the first time in years. "They started it." He looked toward the horizon where the evening light slowly disappeared behind the trees. "And there are still many more waiting for us." Winter arrived quietly over the Montana mountains, covering the forests with fresh snow, while, hundreds of miles away, a different kind of storm slowly gathered around the forgotten history of America's retired military working dogs. The rescue of Ranger and Bella had changed more than public opinion. During the following weeks, Haven Ridge Animal Rescue became the center of an unexpected national movement. Volunteers arrived almost daily with food, blankets, medicine, and transportation offers. Military veterans who had spent years believing their canine partners were gone began contacting Sarah Whitmore, hoping that somewhere inside the growing collection of recovered records they might discover one impossible answer. John Carter welcomed every visitor with quiet humility, but his attention never drifted far from the military data recovered from Shadow's collar. Each evening, after caring for Shadow, Ranger, and Bella, he returned to the small study inside his lakeside cabin. Together with Michael Donovan, he continued examining every hidden file stored inside the encrypted archive. The deeper they searched, the clearer one fact became. Someone had not simply hidden retired military dogs. Someone had built an organized system. Invoices linked transportation companies to storage facilities. Veterinary documents appeared under false business names. Financial records referenced equipment purchases that never reached military kennels. Individually, none of the documents proved criminal intent. Together, they formed a pattern. One snowy afternoon, Michael called unexpectedly. "I found another encrypted folder." John immediately drove to Michael's farmhouse. Unlike previous files, this directory contained no canine records. Instead, it listed personnel identification numbers connected to military logistics offices responsible for retired working dogs nearly a decade earlier. Only one name appeared repeatedly: Leonard Pierce. John quietly repeated the name. "I know him." Michael looked up. "You do?" "He wasn't SEAL." John searched his memory. "He worked logistics." Michael opened the personnel file. Leonard Pierce was now 65 years old. A tall, thin man with pale skin, neatly parted blonde-gray hair, and a clean-shaven face that always appeared carefully composed, Leonard had built his military career behind desks rather than battlefields. Former evaluations consistently described him as intelligent, meticulous, and remarkably organized. Co-workers respected his administrative precision but rarely considered him warm. Years spent competing for promotions had gradually transformed caution into ambition, and ambition into a quiet willingness to ignore ethical boundaries whenever regulations became inconvenient. His retirement address remained current. Small town, northern Wyoming. John studied the screen without speaking. "I only met him twice." "What was he like?" John answered honestly. "The kind of officer who believed paperwork mattered more than people." Michael leaned back. "The financial transfers stopped 6 months after his retirement." John frowned. "So either he walked away, or someone else continued." Neither possibility comforted them. By early evening, they had assembled enough documentation to justify asking questions, but not enough to accuse anyone of orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. John understood the difference better than most people. Military investigations demanded evidence, not suspicion. I'll talk to him. Michael looked uncertain. Alone? John smiled slightly. I've questioned people before. The drive to Wyoming took most of the following day. Shadow accompanied him as always, quietly watching endless snow-covered fields pass beyond the truck windows. Although the old shepherd tired more easily during travel, he seemed noticeably stronger than when John had first found him. Regular meals, medication, and familiar companionship had slowly restored both body and spirit. The small town where Leonard Pierce lived appeared peaceful enough. Modest homes lined quiet streets where neighbors still cleared snow from one another's sidewalks. Children laughed while building snowmen in nearby yards. Nothing suggested that one resident might hold answers to questions buried for nearly a decade. John parked outside a neatly maintained brick house. Every detail reflected discipline. Freshly shoveled walkway, trimmed hedges despite winter, perfectly aligned flower pots waiting for spring. A man who preferred order lived here. John walked to the front porch while Shadow waited calmly beside him. Several moments later, the front door opened. Leonard Pierce had aged considerably since retirement. His posture remained straight, but his shoulders seemed narrower than military photographs remembered. Fine wrinkles surrounded cautious blue eyes that instantly recognized the camouflage jacket standing on the porch. Recognition appeared before surprise. Commander Carter? John noticed that Leonard remembered his rank before his name. Old habits rarely disappeared. It's been a long time. Leonard nodded politely. It has. His attention shifted downward. The moment he saw Shadow, the color drained from his face, for barely a second. Then his composure returned. Most people would never have noticed. John did. So, Leonard forced a small smile. You adopted a German shepherd. John remained silent. He wanted Leonard to keep talking. People often revealed themselves while trying too hard to appear calm. It's an old military dog. John's answer was deliberately simple. Leonard looked again. This time his eyes remained fixed several seconds longer than necessary. His breathing became slightly shallower. John had spent decades reading expressions during interrogations. Fear rarely announced itself loudly. It whispered through tiny details, and Leonard Pierce had just whispered volumes without saying another word. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Snow drifted quietly across the front yard while Leonard Pierce stood motionless in the doorway. His carefully controlled expression had already recovered, but John Carter had spent too many years interviewing frightened informants and enemy prisoners to mistake what he had just witnessed. It had not been recognition of an ordinary German shepherd. It had been recognition of Shadow. Leonard slowly opened the door wider. You'd better come inside. John nodded once before stepping into the warm living room. Shadow followed calmly at his side, his movements slower than they had been years ago, but no less disciplined. The old shepherd paused briefly near the fireplace, quietly studying Leonard without barking. His ears remained forward, and his steady gaze never left the retired logistics officer. The house reflected a lifetime devoted to order. Every bookshelf was perfectly arranged. Framed military certificates hung in symmetrical rows. Even the coffee cups resting on the kitchen counter appeared carefully aligned. Yet beneath that orderly appearance, John sensed something else. A man who had spent years trying to keep his past under control. Leonard prepared coffee with trembling hands he unsuccessfully tried to hide. I've seen the news, he finally admitted. The rescue stories. The old military dogs. John accepted the cup, but never looked away from him. Then you know why I'm here. Leonard lowered his eyes. I suspected you would come eventually. The room fell silent again. John reached into his jacket and carefully placed several printed documents on the table. Transportation records, hidden invoices, the recovered archive showing dozens of retired military dogs officially listed as deceased while separate files documented transfers to private buyers. Leonard stared at the papers for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than before. I never imagined anyone would find those records. You knew they existed. Yes. Did you create them? Leonard slowly shook his head. No. He removed his glasses and rubbed tired eyes. I helped process retirement paperwork, that's all. John remained patient. Then explain the rest. Leonard looked toward Shadow. The old shepherd remained perfectly still beside John's chair. I remember him. His voice softened. He wasn't just another dog. No, John replied quietly. He wasn't. Leonard closed his eyes. It started with budgets. John listened without interruption. Funding for retired military working dogs was reduced several times. Facilities became overcrowded. Caring for elderly service dogs cost far more than administrators wanted to admit. He swallowed heavily. Someone proposed another solution. John's expression hardened. What solution? They reported some retired dogs as deceased. The words lingered painfully in the quiet room. Officially, the dogs had died after retirement processing. But they hadn't. No. Leonard's shoulders slumped. They were transferred instead. Transferred where? Private buyers, unscrupulous breeding operations, security companies that wanted trained dogs without paying military training costs. Some simply disappeared through brokers. John felt anger rising inside him, but his voice remained calm. And the money? Leonard looked ashamed. The government continued allocating care funds for dogs that supposedly remained in the retirement system. He paused. Those funds were diverted. John understood immediately. So the dogs disappeared, and the money meant to care for them disappeared too. Leonard nodded without lifting his head. I signed paperwork I should never have signed. Why? I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone. His laugh carried no humor. I convinced myself the dogs would still be cared for. He looked toward Shadow again. I was wrong. John remained silent. Sometimes silence encouraged truth more effectively than accusation. Leonard continued speaking. There were dozens of us processing different parts of the paperwork. Most never understood the full picture. I didn't either at first. What changed? I visited one holding facility. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. I saw old military dogs locked inside filthy kennels waiting to be sold. He closed his eyes briefly. That's when I realized what we'd actually become part of. Why didn't you report it? I was afraid. The answer came almost as a whisper. I had a family, a pension, everything I'd worked for. He looked around his immaculate home. I kept telling myself someone else would expose it. Instead, no one did. John studied the man before him. He saw no arrogance, only years of regret. Leonard slowly stood and walked toward an old filing cabinet tucked into the corner of his study. I couldn't live with it. After unlocking the bottom drawer, he removed a weathered document case wrapped in plastic. I kept copies. John's eyes narrowed. What kind of copies? Original retirement authorizations, financial approvals, internal memorandums, shipment manifests. He placed the case on the table, and one list of every person who approved the false death reports. John carefully opened the folder. Every page carried original signatures, official seals, dates, approval chains, evidence, real evidence, far stronger than the hidden database alone. Leonard exhaled slowly. I should have turned these over years ago. You still can. I know. His voice steadied for the first time. I'm ready. Over the following weeks, John, Michael Donovan, Leonard Pierce, and attorneys working with several veterans organizations carefully organized every document recovered from both the hidden data chip and Leonard's files. Nothing was released publicly until investigators confirmed the records independently. When federal investigators finally opened a formal inquiry, additional witnesses came forward. Former employees, contract drivers, administrative clerks. One testimony supported another. The hidden network that had quietly erased retired military working dogs from official records began collapsing under the weight of its own paperwork. Newspapers across the country carried the story, not as political controversy, but as a betrayal of loyal service animals that had faithfully served alongside American soldiers. Several former officials faced criminal investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying government records. Additional agencies reopened retirement files dating back nearly a decade. Among the evidence presented, one name appeared repeatedly: Shadow. Investigators described him as the final living military dog whose survival connected the false records to the hidden transfer network. Without him, the concealed data chip would likely never have been discovered. Without that chip, the truth might have remained buried forever. One evening, after returning home from another long meeting with investigators, John sat quietly on the porch overlooking the frozen lake. Shadow slowly settled beside his chair. The old commander rested one hand gently upon the shepherd's neck. "They almost erased all of you." Shadow leaned calmly against his leg. John looked across the darkening water. "They failed." In the fading light, neither man nor dog needed another word to understand that justice had finally begun, not only for Shadow, but for every forgotten hero whose name had nearly disappeared forever. Spring arrived with gentle rain across the northern valleys, washing away the last traces of winter while giving the forests around Haven Ridge new life. Yet beyond the fresh green hills, one final rescue still waited. Although the federal investigation continued making headlines across the country, John Carter had never viewed paperwork as the end of his mission. Every recovered document represented another possibility that somewhere, another forgotten military working dog still needed help. Several anonymous tips had reached Haven Ridge since the investigation became public, and one message stood apart from the others. It described an abandoned industrial property hidden deep within an old lumber district near the state border. Witnesses claimed elderly German shepherds could sometimes be heard barking inside after dark. Sarah Whitmore immediately forwarded the information to local authorities, but the location appeared complicated. The property had changed ownership multiple times through shell companies. Legal paperwork delayed immediate action, while local animal welfare officers struggled to gain access. John quietly studied the photographs provided by volunteers: a weathered warehouse, broken windows, collapsed fencing, smoke stains near the roof. Nothing suggested a place where animals should still be living. "I've seen buildings like this before," he said softly. Michael Donovan looked across the table. "So have I." Sarah frowned. "We'll wait for the warrant." John nodded. "Of course." But everyone in the room shared the same concern. If frightened dogs remained inside dangerous buildings, waiting too long carried risks of its own. 3 days later, the court finally approved emergency entry after additional evidence confirmed neglected animals on the property. Animal welfare officers assembled a rescue team before sunrise. Volunteer veterinarians prepared transport vehicles. Firefighters accompanied the operation because structural engineers warned that portions of the warehouse roof appeared dangerously unstable. John had no official role in the rescue, yet when Sarah quietly asked whether he would come in case retired military dogs were found, he answered without hesitation, "Shadow and I will be there." The convoy reached the abandoned lumber yard shortly after dawn. Rain from the previous evening had left the muddy ground slick beneath heavy boots. Rusted machinery surrounded the enormous warehouse, its faded walls scarred by decades of neglect. Several sections of the roof sagged noticeably beneath rotten wooden beams. Captain Rachel Morgan coordinated the emergency operation. At 46 years old, she possessed the composed confidence of an experienced fire officer. Tall and athletic, with dark brown hair secured beneath her helmet, calm green eyes, and lightly weathered skin from years of emergency response, Rachel rarely raised her voice. Losing 2 firefighters during a warehouse collapse early in her career had permanently shaped her leadership. Since then, every rescue she commanded balanced courage with careful planning, never allowing emotion to replace safety. She greeted John respectfully. "I've heard about you." John smiled politely. "I'd rather today be about the dogs." Rachel nodded. "So would I." Animal welfare officers entered first. Several minutes later, radio reports confirmed multiple elderly dogs inside. Some required immediate medical care. Volunteers carefully carried the first rescued shepherd toward waiting veterinary vehicles, then another, then a Labrador. Each rescue brought visible relief across the assembled team. Shadow remained quietly beside John throughout the operation. Despite advanced age and aching joints, the old German shepherd watched every doorway with unwavering focus. John noticed the familiar expression. Shadow had entered operational mode. Suddenly, one firefighter sprinted from the warehouse entrance. "Everyone out!" The warning echoed across the yard. Rachel immediately grabbed her radio. "What happened?" "Fire!" Dark smoke began rolling upward from the rear section of the building. Within seconds, orange flames appeared beneath the damaged roof. Years of neglected electrical wiring had finally failed. Rachel's voice became sharp. "Evacuate!" Rescuers hurried toward safety carrying frightened dogs. Head counts began immediately. 1, 3, 6, 9. Rachel looked toward her lieutenant. "Everyone accounted for?" His face changed instantly. "No." The silence that followed felt heavier than the smoke rising into the gray morning sky. "Who?" "A volunteer." He checked his clipboard. "Emily Ross." John's heart sank. The young veterinary technician who had first cared for Shadow at Haven Ridge had entered moments earlier searching the rear kennels. Now she remained somewhere inside the burning warehouse. Rachel immediately ordered firefighters to prepare for interior rescue. Before anyone could move, Shadow suddenly stood. The old German shepherd stared directly toward the smoke-filled entrance. Every muscle in his aging body tightened. John recognized that posture immediately. Shadow had found someone. Before Captain Rachel Morgan could issue another command, Shadow lunged forward. "Shadow!" John shouted instinctively. The old German shepherd did not hesitate. Despite stiff joints and years that had slowed his body, he crossed the muddy ground with astonishing determination, disappearing through the smoke-filled entrance. Every firefighter turned toward the doorway in disbelief. Rachel immediately stepped forward. "No one goes in alone." John met her eyes. "My dog knows exactly what he's doing." She understood what he truly meant. Military working dogs did not search randomly. They followed training, scent, and instinct with extraordinary precision. Rachel signaled her crew. "Fire suppression team with me. Structural team stays outside. If those beams start moving, everybody comes out immediately." John tightened the straps of the protective jacket one firefighter quickly handed him. He knew it would offer little protection against a collapsing roof, but standing outside while Shadow searched alone was never an option. "I've spent my whole career following him into danger," he said quietly. "I'm not stopping now." Rachel gave a single nod. "Stay behind my crew." The heat struck them the moment they entered. Thick black smoke rolled across the ceiling, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Water from broken pipes mixed with ash on the concrete floor, creating a slippery maze of debris. Somewhere deeper inside the warehouse came the frightened barking of dogs that had already been secured inside transport crates awaiting evacuation. Then John heard it. One sharp bark, not panic, a signal. Shadow. "There!" John called. The rescue team followed the sound through a narrow corridor littered with broken timber and rusted equipment. Suddenly, another bark echoed from behind a partially collapsed storage room. Rachel pointed. "He's found her." 2 firefighters forced open the twisted metal door. Inside, Emily Ross lay trapped beneath a fallen wooden support beam. Dust covered her Navy volunteer jacket, and blood ran from a cut above her forehead. She remained conscious, but struggled to free one leg pinned beneath the heavy timber. Beside her stood Shadow. The old shepherd had positioned himself between Emily and the growing flames spreading along the wall. His body remained low and steady, barking only when rescuers came into view before immediately falling silent again. Emily looked up through tears. "He found me." John knelt beside her. "We're getting you out." Firefighters lifted the beam using hydraulic equipment, while Rachel monitored the ceiling above them. "We're losing time," she warned. "The roof is shifting." The timber finally rose enough for Emily to pull her injured leg free. One firefighter supported her weight while another wrapped a fire-resistant blanket around her shoulders. Rachel turned toward the exit. "Move!" The team began retreating through the smoke. John looked behind him. Shadow had not moved. The old German shepherd stood staring toward another corner of the room. "What is it, partner?" Shadow barked once before limping toward a collapsed wire kennel buried beneath fallen boards. A weak whimper answered. John hurried after him. Hidden beneath the debris lay a small, elderly mixed-breed dog trembling in fear, unable to escape. Rachel saw them changing direction. "John!" He ignored the warning. Together, he and Shadow pulled away splintered boards while one firefighter rushed over to help. Moments later, the frightened dog was lifted free and wrapped safely inside another blanket. Only then did Shadow turn toward the exit. A loud cracking sound echoed overhead. Rachel's voice rang through the warehouse. "Everybody out! Now!" The rescue team sprinted through choking smoke. John remained only a step behind Shadow as the old German shepherd struggled across the wet concrete floor. Every stride clearly caused pain, yet he refused to slow. The moment the last firefighter crossed the doorway, a deafening roar shook the building. The rear section of the warehouse collapsed into itself. Flames burst through the roof as massive wooden beams crashed onto the exact room they had left only seconds earlier. Silence spread across the rescue scene. Then applause. Not loud or celebratory. Quiet, emotional. Several firefighters removed their helmets. Rachel walked directly to John and Shadow. For a long moment, she simply looked at the aging German shepherd whose breathing had become heavy from exhaustion. "I've worked 21 years in the fire service," she said softly. "I've never seen courage like that." Emily, her ankle bandaged and her forehead stitched by paramedics, slowly approached despite medical staff urging her to remain seated. She knelt with difficulty before Shadow. Her hands trembled as she gently embraced his neck. "You came back for me." Shadow rested his gray muzzle against her shoulder. John quietly looked away, allowing her private moment with the dog who had saved her life. News helicopters arrived before sunset. By evening, every major television network carried the same image. Not the burning warehouse. Not the collapsing roof. Instead, cameras focused on an elderly former Navy SEAL sitting on the tailgate of an old pickup truck beside a gray-faced German shepherd wrapped in a firefighter's blanket while a young veterinary volunteer held the dog's paw. Across America, viewers watched Captain Rachel Morgan answer a reporter's question. "Who deserves the credit for today's rescue?" She smiled toward Shadow. "We all did our jobs." Then her voice softened. "But that old military dog reminded every one of us what real service looks like." Within days, schools invited veterans to speak about military working dogs. Animal rescue organizations reported record numbers of adoption applications for senior dogs. Donations reached Haven Ridge from every state. Newspapers began referring to Shadow not simply as a rescued military dog, but as a national symbol of loyalty that had survived betrayal without ever abandoning his instinct to protect others. Late one evening, after the interviews had ended and the crowds had disappeared, John sat on the porch of his lakeside cabin, with Shadow resting beside him beneath a blanket. The old shepherd's breathing was slower than usual. John gently scratched behind his ears. "You've saved lives your whole career." Shadow looked toward the quiet lake. John smiled. "And somehow—" He paused, emotion tightening his voice. "You still believed there was one more person worth running into the fire for." The old German shepherd quietly laid his head across John's boot as the last light of day faded beyond the trees, leaving behind a silence filled not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Golden sunlight spread across Washington, D.C. as rows of American flags moved gently in the spring breeze, transforming the nation's capital into a place of remembrance rather than ceremony alone. Nearly 2 months had passed since the warehouse rescue. Shadow's courageous actions had reached every corner of the country. Television interviews gradually faded, but something far more meaningful remained behind. Veterans organizations, military families, animal welfare groups, and lawmakers found themselves asking the same question. How many military working dogs had served America with extraordinary loyalty, only to disappear into silence after retirement? The investigation launched by federal authorities continued uncovering additional evidence, while public support for retired military dogs grew stronger each week. Petitions circulated nationwide calling for permanent reforms protecting military working animals after service. Thousands of handwritten letters arrived at Haven Ridge Animal Rescue from school children thanking Shadow and the many dogs whose stories had finally been told. One quiet afternoon, John Carter received an official envelope bearing the seal of the United States Department of Defense. He opened it carefully. Inside rested a formal invitation. A national ceremony would be held in Washington to recognize retired military working dogs whose service had never received proper public acknowledgement. Veterans from every branch of the armed forces would attend. Families of fallen handlers had also been invited. At the center of the ceremony stood one special request. Shadow was to receive a Medal of Distinguished Service, honoring not only his own military career, but symbolically representing every forgotten working dog whose sacrifice had remained hidden for years. John read the letter twice before quietly setting it down. Shadow slept peacefully beside the fireplace, unaware that history had finally begun correcting one of its oldest mistakes. Several days later, John and Shadow arrived in Washington. The city appeared very different from the battlefields John remembered during his years of service. Crowds filled the sidewalks, tourists photographed monuments, and spring flowers surrounded government buildings with unexpected warmth. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, preparations for the ceremony quietly continued. Military personnel escorted John to the historic hall where the event would take place. Inside, dozens of retired military working dogs rested beside former handlers wearing uniforms from different decades. Some dogs moved confidently despite gray muzzles. Others walked slowly with the help of orthopedic harnesses. Every pair carried visible signs of age, but the affection between soldier and dog remained unmistakable. Shadow calmly observed the room before lying beside John's chair. Several veterans quietly approached simply to shake John's hand. None asked for photographs. Most only wished to thank him. Near the front of the hall stood Rear Admiral Thomas Whitmore, a distinguished naval officer in his early 60s. Tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed neatly combed silver hair, alert blue eyes, and a composed expression shaped by decades of leadership rather than politics. His crisp white dress uniform reflected meticulous discipline, yet those who served with him often described him as approachable and deeply respectful toward enlisted personnel. Years earlier, he had commanded naval personnel responsible for improving military working dog retirement policies after witnessing firsthand the bond between handlers and their canine partners during overseas deployments. After greeting John warmly, the Admiral quietly admitted something unexpected. "I owe Shadow an apology." John looked surprised. "You do?" Whitmore nodded. "We should have recognized these dogs long before now." For several moments, neither man spoke. The Admiral gently knelt beside Shadow. The old German shepherd calmly accepted the greeting without moving from John's side. "He doesn't know he's famous," Whitmore said with a soft smile. John looked toward his old companion. "He never worked for attention." The Admiral stood again. "That's exactly why he deserves it." Nearby, journalists quietly arranged cameras, while military musicians rehearsed patriotic hymns. Volunteers carefully positioned chairs reserved for elderly veterans who found walking increasingly difficult. Everywhere John looked, he saw people moving with unusual care, almost as though everyone understood the day belonged not to speeches, but to gratitude. As guests gradually filled the hall, John noticed familiar faces among the audience. Daniel Foster had traveled across the country with Ranger resting comfortably beside him. Other handlers reunited with dogs recovered during the investigation sat together, exchanging quiet conversations that often ended in emotional silence. No one needed lengthy introductions. Shared experiences had already made them family. The Master of Ceremonies eventually approached John. "We'd like you to say a few words after the medal presentation." John hesitated. He had spoken before military units many times during his career. Public audiences felt entirely different. "I'll try." The coordinator smiled kindly. "Just speak from your heart." John looked down at Shadow. The old shepherd slowly lifted his gray muzzle and met his eyes. Somehow that simple glance eased every remaining doubt. The lights gradually dimmed as the military band concluded the opening hymn. A quiet stillness settled across the historic hall, replacing conversation with anticipation. Nearly every seat was occupied. Veterans in dress uniforms sat beside civilians, families of former handlers, animal rescue volunteers, and representatives from military organizations across the country. Outside the building, television trucks lined the streets. Millions of Americans were already watching the live broadcast. The Master of Ceremonies stepped to the podium. "Today, we honor courage that never asked to be remembered." A large screen behind the stage began displaying photographs recovered during the federal investigation. Young soldiers stood beside alert German shepherds during training exercises. Handlers smiled while muddy dogs leaned proudly against their legs after successful missions. Other images showed aging military working dogs during retirement, their faces grayer but their eyes no less loyal. Many in the audience quietly wiped away tears. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitmore approached the podium next. His steady voice carried easily throughout the hall. "For generations, military working dogs have protected American service members without asking for recognition. They have detected explosives, rescued survivors, guarded installations, and stood beside our soldiers in places where fear was constant." He paused. Too many completed those missions only to disappear into silence. The hall remained completely still. Today that silence ends. Applause filled the room. Not loud or celebratory. Deep, respectful. The Admiral turned toward John. "Commander John Carter, would you and Shadow please join me?" John slowly rose. His heart condition had weakened his stamina during recent months, yet he stood with the same quiet dignity that had once earned the trust of every member of his SEAL unit. His faded woodland camouflage jacket remained neatly pressed despite its age, a visible reminder that some uniforms represented memories rather than rank. Shadow walked beside him. The elderly German shepherd moved carefully across the stage, his gray muzzle reflecting the bright lights above. Arthritis had slowed his pace, but nothing diminished the calm confidence in his posture. He neither searched for attention nor reacted to the hundreds of people watching him. He remained focused only on John. The audience noticed. Several veterans quietly smiled. "They're still a team," someone whispered. The Admiral knelt before Shadow. A specially crafted medal of distinguished service rested upon a dark blue ribbon embroidered with gold lettering, recognizing decades of faithful military service. Rather than placing it around Shadow's neck immediately, Whitmore gently rested one hand upon the old shepherd's shoulder. "On behalf of a grateful nation," his voice briefly caught with emotion. "Thank you." He carefully fastened the medal to Shadow's ceremonial collar. For a moment, no one moved. Then the entire audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. Many veterans saluted, others simply placed a hand over their hearts. John looked toward Shadow. The old shepherd calmly sat beside him exactly as he had done countless times during military briefings years earlier, completely unaware that history had finally acknowledged what so many had always known. When the applause gradually faded, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Commander Carter has agreed to share a few memories." John stepped forward. He rarely enjoyed speaking about himself, so he didn't. Instead, he spoke about the men who never returned home. He described freezing nights in distant mountains where frightened young soldiers found courage simply because a military dog quietly refused to leave their side. He recalled missions where German shepherds detected hidden explosives seconds before entire patrols stepped forward. He remembered helicopters lifting wounded handlers while loyal dogs refused to leave until ordered. "There are stories," John said softly, "that never appear in history books." The audience listened in complete silence. "I've watched young Marines survive because a dog noticed danger before any human could. I've watched soldiers share their last canteen of water with partners who could never speak a single word." He looked down at Shadow. "And I've seen dogs wait beside hospital beds for handlers who never woke up." Many people in the audience quietly lowered their heads. John continued, "We often describe these animals as equipment." He slowly shook his head. "They were never equipment. They were teammates." His final words lingered throughout the hall. "When America remembers its heroes, I hope we never again forget the ones who served on 4 legs." Silence followed, then another standing ovation. Television cameras captured elderly veterans embracing one another throughout the audience. The ceremony continued with presentations honoring additional retired military working dogs recovered during the investigation. Ranger quietly received recognition beside Daniel Foster. Bella accepted hers, while former search and rescue personnel stood proudly behind her. Several families accepted memorial certificates on behalf of dogs that had passed away before justice finally arrived. Outside the hall, giant video screens broadcast the ceremony to thousands gathered along nearby streets. Across the country, veterans centers, schools, military bases, and animal shelters organized public viewings. Messages of gratitude flooded social media. Children mailed drawings of military dogs wearing medals. Former handlers who had remained silent for decades began sharing photographs and stories they had never before found the strength to tell. Perhaps the most emotional moments came after the official ceremony ended. Inside a nearby memorial garden, dozens of retired handlers reunited with dogs recovered during the nationwide rescue effort. Some reunions were joyful, others were quiet beyond words. One elderly Marine sat on the grass for nearly 20 minutes without speaking as his gray-faced Labrador rested peacefully across his lap. Another veteran gently brushed the fur of a German shepherd he had believed dead for almost 8 years. No reporters interrupted. No speeches followed. The simple presence of old friends reunited after impossible loss proved more powerful than any ceremony. John watched from a short distance. Sarah Whitmore quietly joined him. Her silver-streaked hair moved gently in the afternoon breeze as she smiled through tears. "You changed their lives." John looked across the garden where Shadow rested peacefully beside Ranger and Bella, while former handlers surrounded them with gentle affection. "No," he answered softly. "They waited all these years." He paused. "We just helped them find each other again." As the sun slowly descended beyond the monuments of Washington, one image remained on television screens across America. an aging Navy SEAL sitting quietly beneath a flowering tree while 3 elderly military dogs rested peacefully at his feet, surrounded by veterans who had finally found the companions they thought history had taken away forever. A warm summer breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the Montana Valley, where an open field that had once stood empty now echoed with the joyful sounds of barking dogs and quiet laughter. Nearly a year had passed since the national ceremony in Washington. Life had changed in ways John Carter never imagined possible. Letters still arrived almost every week from veterans, school children, military families, and strangers who had been moved by Shadow's story. Donations continued reaching Haven Ridge from every corner of the country. Yet John understood that public attention, no matter how sincere, would eventually fade. The dogs could not wait for headlines. They needed something permanent. One evening, while sitting on the porch overlooking the lake, John unfolded a faded notebook where he had once planned military operations decades earlier. Instead of maps and tactical objectives, he began sketching something entirely different. Kennels designed for elderly dogs, large grassy exercise yards, quiet walking trails shaded by pine trees, a veterinary clinic, small cabins where retired handlers could temporarily stay beside the dogs they had reunited with after years apart. When Sarah Whitmore visited several days later, John quietly slid the notebook across the table. She studied every page before looking up. "You've been planning this for a while." John smiled gently. "I think my last mission needs a headquarters." Sarah laughed softly through moist eyes. The two of them immediately began discussing practical details rather than dreams. The land beside John's cabin stretched across several unused acres overlooking the lake. With careful planning, there would be enough room for elderly military working dogs to spend their remaining years peacefully while remaining close to nature. John made one decision without hesitation. Every remaining dollar from his military pension would go toward the project. Sarah looked concerned. "John," he raised one hand, "I've spent my whole life saving for retirement." He looked toward Shadow sleeping peacefully beneath a maple tree. "I've already found what retirement was supposed to be." Construction began early that autumn. Local contractors volunteered labor after hearing the story behind the project. Lumber companies donated building materials. Veterinarians offered equipment. Military veterans traveled from several states to help clear land, build fencing, and plant trees. No one worked because they expected recognition. They worked because they believed the dogs had already earned everything being built. Michael Donovan supervised the installation of modern security systems while joking that he finally had another mission worthy of his engineering skills. Sarah coordinated medical planning with Haven Ridge, ensuring every kennel would prioritize comfort rather than appearance. Throughout the construction, Shadow quietly observed everything. Although his movements had become noticeably slower after the warehouse rescue, the old German Shepherd insisted on making daily rounds beside John. Workers smiled whenever they saw him patiently inspecting freshly completed walking paths or resting beneath unfinished porch roofs as though supervising every detail. One afternoon, a young volunteer approached John carrying a small wooden sign. Her name was Lily Bennett, a 19-year-old college student studying veterinary medicine. Petite, with shoulder-length auburn hair, bright hazel eyes, and lightly sun-kissed skin, Lily possessed an infectious optimism that seemed to encourage frightened animals almost immediately. Growing up on a small ranch where neglected horses and abandoned dogs frequently found temporary shelter, had inspired her lifelong dream of caring for elderly working animals. She spoke gently, listened carefully, and never appeared to mind difficult work. She held up the carved sign. "What should we call this place?" John remained silent for a long moment. Then he looked toward Shadow. The old shepherd had fallen asleep beneath the shade of a young oak tree, his gray muzzle resting peacefully across crossed paws. John smiled. The Shadow Veterans Working Dog Center. Several nearby volunteers quietly applauded, not because of the name alone, but because everyone understood exactly who had inspired it. Months later, the final fence section was completed. Fresh grass covered the once empty field. Wide walking trails wound gently through pine trees surrounding the property. Comfortable cabins overlooked the lake, allowing elderly handlers to spend time beside retired military dogs in peaceful surroundings. On opening day, the first transport vehicles slowly arrived. Inside traveled elderly military working dogs rescued from shelters, private owners unable to continue providing care, and several government retirement programs that had officially partnered with the new center. John greeted every arrival personally, not as a commander, simply as another old soldier welcoming friends home. Shadow waited quietly beside the entrance. One by one, newly arrived dogs approached him. Some sniffed cautiously. Others immediately relaxed beside the elderly shepherd as though sensing they had reached a place where no one expected anything from them except to rest. Watching them, Sarah whispered softly, "They trust him." John nodded. "They know he's been where they are." The opening weeks passed more quietly than anyone had expected. There were no television crews waiting outside the gates, no speeches, and no ceremonies. The excitement that had surrounded the national recognition slowly faded into something far more meaningful, the gentle rhythm of ordinary days. Sunrise walks replaced interviews, veterinary appointments replaced press conferences. Laughter from visiting families gradually became the soundtrack of the center. For John Carter, that was exactly how he wanted it. Every morning began the same way. Before the volunteers arrived, he walked the winding trails with Shadow at his side. Their pace had become noticeably slower over the past year. John's heart often reminded him that time remained precious, while Shadow's aging hips stiffened during cool mornings. Yet neither seemed bothered by moving more slowly. They had spent enough years running. Now they simply enjoyed walking together. Something unexpected soon became apparent. Many newly rescued military dogs arrived frightened, withdrawn, and unwilling to trust people again. Some refused to leave their kennels. Others flinched whenever someone reached toward them. Years of neglect had convinced them that human hands brought only pain or abandonment. No training program seemed to reach them. Shadow did. John noticed it first with an elderly Belgian Malinois named Cooper. At nearly 12 years old, Cooper still possessed the lean, athletic frame typical of his breed, although age had dulled his once sharp reflexes. His short tan coat bore several healed scars across his chest, and one torn ear hinted at years spent in dangerous environments. After serving as an explosive detection dog, Cooper had passed through several owners before finally arriving at the center deeply distrustful of strangers. He growled whenever volunteers approached his kennel and refused every attempt to encourage him outside. One afternoon, Shadow quietly wandered toward Cooper's enclosure without any encouragement from John. The old German shepherd neither barked nor attempted to play. He simply lay down several feet away beneath the shade of a pine tree. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then Cooper slowly stood. He walked toward the fence. Minutes later, he stepped outside his kennel for the first time since arriving. From that day forward, volunteers witnessed the same quiet miracle again and again. A frightened Labrador followed Shadow onto a walking trail after refusing exercise for weeks. A retired patrol shepherd accepted gentle petting only after watching Shadow calmly lean against John's leg. Dogs that had forgotten how to trust people somehow remembered by watching another dog trust first. Sarah Whitmore smiled every time she saw it. "We've hired the best therapist in America." John laughed softly, and he doesn't even know it. Word of these remarkable changes spread among military communities and animal rescue organizations. Veterinarians began recommending the Center for Elderly Working Dogs struggling emotionally after retirement. Families who believed their aging companions would never adapt again often left with tears of relief after seeing quiet transformations they had thought impossible. Months became years. Hundreds of retired military working dogs passed through the center. Some remained for the rest of their lives, surrounded by people who finally understood them. Many more found permanent homes with families willing to open both their houses and their hearts. Each adoption day became its own celebration. John never viewed those departures as goodbyes. He considered them successful missions. Former handlers also continued arriving. Some reunited with partners they had believed dead. Others came simply to volunteer after hearing the center's story. The cabins surrounding the lake often filled with elderly veterans who spent peaceful weekends walking beside dogs that reminded them of friends long gone. No one needed to explain the silence shared during those walks. Those who had served already understood. One warm autumn evening, nearly 3 years after the center first opened its gates, children gathered beneath the large oak tree near the entrance while John spoke quietly about loyalty, courage, and responsibility. He never glorified war. Instead, he spoke about friendship. He told them that true heroes rarely searched for recognition. "They simply do the right thing," he said, gently resting his hand on Shadow's shoulder, "even when nobody is watching." The children looked toward the gray-faced German shepherd sleeping peacefully beside him. To them, Shadow was already a legend. To John, he remained the same loyal partner who had once waited patiently beside helicopters before dangerous missions. Time continued moving forward. John's hair grew whiter. His steps became slower. Shadow's muzzle turned almost completely silver, and longer afternoon naps gradually replaced energetic morning walks. Yet every evening, no matter how tired either of them felt, they still visited the wooden bench overlooking the center. It had become their place. From there, they watched volunteers laughing with rescued dogs, families leaving with newly adopted companions, and retired handlers sharing stories over cups of coffee on shaded porches. Everything John had hoped to build now existed before his eyes. One peaceful evening, the sky above the valley glowed with deep shades of gold and crimson as the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine trees across the quiet grounds. Dogs played happily in the open fields while volunteers finished the last evening chores before heading home. John lowered himself carefully onto the old wooden bench facing the center. The familiar effort reminded him once again that his heart no longer possessed the strength it once had. Shadow slowly climbed onto the grass beside him. The old German shepherd looked across the grounds one final time before quietly settling against John's boots. For several minutes, they simply watched. A young family walked toward their car with a retired shepherd they had adopted that afternoon. 2 elderly veterans smiled as they strolled along the lakeside trail with rescued companions. Near the main building, Sarah laughed with several volunteers while Lily welcomed another newly arrived military dog through the front gate. Life continued, exactly as John had hoped. He gently rested his weathered hand upon Shadow's silver-gray head. The old shepherd slowly lifted his eyes. Those familiar amber eyes still carried the same unwavering trust they had shared decades earlier on distant battlefields. John smiled. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We've completed our final mission, old friend." Shadow looked at him for one long, peaceful moment. Then, with quiet contentment, he gently rested his head across John's knee. Neither of them needed another command. The evening breeze continued moving softly through the pine trees as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a place where forgotten heroes would never again be forgotten, and where loyalty had finally found the home it had always deserved. If this story touched your heart, perhaps it wasn't by accident. Sometimes God doesn't perform miracles by changing the world overnight. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog, a courageous soul, or an ordinary person willing to do one extraordinary act of kindness. Shadow never asked for recognition. John never expected another mission. Yet God brought them back together at exactly the right moment to restore justice, heal broken hearts, and remind us that faithfulness is never forgotten in His eyes. Maybe someone in your life is waiting for hope today. Maybe someone feels forgotten, abandoned, or unseen. Be the kindness that God uses to change their story. One small act of compassion can become someone else's miracle. If you believe loyalty, love, and mercy still have the power to change the world, please leave a comment with the words, "God never forgets His faithful ones." I'd love to know where you're watching from and which moment of this story touched your heart the most. Please share this video with someone who loves dogs, honors our veterans, or simply needs a reminder that hope is never truly lost. And if you enjoy stories of courage, faith, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, fill your home with peace, and surround you with faithful friends wherever life leads you. Thank you for watching, and may His grace go with you always.